Hello everyone, welcome, good evening. Firstly, I acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we meet and whose cultures are amongst the oldest continuing cultures in human history. My name is Leonard Blaseby. I'm the Head of Mission for the International Committee of the Red Cross based here in Canberra. My role this evening is simply to introduce Vincent Bernard, who is the moderator for this evening. He is the head of the Law and Policy Forum for the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in our headquarters in Geneva. I'd like to thank also the Centre for Military and Security Law at the Australian National University, and in particular Hitoshi Nasu, for co-hosting this event with the ICRC. So I'd like to welcome everyone who's here in person, as well as the global audience, because this is live streamed as part of the research and debate cycle on Principles Guiding Humanitarian Action for the Forum on Law and Policy. So without further ado, I hand you over to Vincent Bernard. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Thank you, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. As Len just said, this event is part of a larger cycle we have been running with a series of events. I think it's the ninth event in this series. It started in Geneva a year ago, and we had several discussions, symposiums on various subjects around the humanitarian principles and their importance in today's international relations. We are discussing an important issue, the respect for this space for humanitarian action in modern conflicts. And we've covered several aspects of this problem. We looked at the history of the principles guiding humanitarian action. We've looked at them as a tool for humanitarian actors to operate in conflict areas. We have looked at elements of professionalization of the humanitarian sector, of the effectiveness of the humanitarian sector, and we've used the humanitarian principles throughout these discussions to test how far they are still relevant in today's conflicts. So this evening we are discussing a very important question indeed. Should militaries be involved in providing humanitarian assistance during conflict? It's an important issue, and we will use a debate format to explore this question. So we have asked 4 distinguished specialists to adopt very clear-cut positions. And this way we hope to clarify some of these questions which are raised by the fact that more and more we see the involvement of the militaries on the battlefield, providing humanitarian assistance, providing aid in different circumstances. Very often we see that in times of disasters, but that's not what we will be talking about tonight. It's the question and the particular challenges we face when the military, when the armed forces use sometimes this aid to win hearts and minds, or when they are involved in humanitarian operations, simply, what kind of challenges does it create? So, to bring light to the challenges, we've asked our 4 panelists to argue in favor or against the involvement of the militaries in providing humanitarian assistance. So, let me, before introducing our 4 panelists, let me test your opinion on that. It would be interesting to see whether our panelists managed to convince you tonight. So we need to have a benchmark for this discussion. So I would like you to raise your hands if you think that the militaries should be involved in providing humanitarian assistance during conflicts. So quite a number. Difficult to vote. Please make it very apparent. Yes, okay. So I would say that we have about a good third of the audience, maybe half. What would you say? Yeah, who agree with this idea. Okay. So who would be against this idea of the involvement of militaries in humanitarian assistance? Yes. Okay. Right. It seems that they are on that side of the room. That's disturbing. So I guess that some people have not yet made up their minds. So who would be balanced in this discussion or have a neutral view at this moment? My ICRC colleagues are clearly neutral. That's how they should be. Excellent. So thank you. We'll see at the end of this discussion if some of you change their minds. Of course, we know that it's a world where there are many nuances, and our experts are used to work with nuances. So the first thing I have to mention is that they accepted tonight to take unnuanced positions, even though you may introduce nuances in your points, but the discussion does not necessarily reflect their own personal views. And I think it's important that we mention this at the outset. They've accepted to take one position or the other, but this may not be what they actually think. So thanks for accepting the terms of this debate. Thank you very much. So now, I won't say much more. It's time we move to the discussion, but I will first introduce our four panelists in the order that they will adopt for our discussion this evening. So I think the first one to speak this evening from the affirmative team will be Dr. Ned Dobos. Ned is a military ethicist at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. His research specialization is the ethics of war and political violence, with particular interests in armed humanitarian intervention, pacifism, and soldier-state relations. So welcome. Second, we'll have Professor William Maley. William is Professor of Diplomacy at the Asia-Pacific College of Diplomacy. He's a member of the editorial board of the journal Global Responsibility to Protect and of the International Advisory Board of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination at Princeton University. He has published extensively, as of our panelists tonight, but some of his publications are really relevant to the subject we will be discussing. He has published on civil-military relations, especially in the context of Afghanistan. So he's the author of Rescuing Afghanistan. He co-edited From Civil Strife to Civil Society, Civil and Military Responsibilities in Disrupted States, and several other publications. So he is particularly well placed to discuss this subject. Then we are very pleased to have Melissa Connolly-Tyler. Melissa was appointed National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2006. She's a lawyer and specialist in conflict resolution, and her recent research focuses on Australian foreign policy making, Australia's term on the UN Security Council, and Australia as a middle power. So welcome. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we will give the floor to Dr. Mike Kelly. Mike is a former Minister for Defence Material and Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in the Australian government from 2007 to 2013. Prior to entering the Australian Parliament, Dr. Kelly served for 20 years in the Australian Army, and I just learned that he was also a member of the ICRC in very difficult circumstances in Bosnia during the war. So this also adds to his direct experience of the issue at stake, the relations of the military to aid and humanitarian action. So the format of this debate is quite clear, quite precise. We will give the floor to our affirmative team, starting with Ned, and then the first speaker from the negative team, Bill, will reply, and then it will be the turn of Melissa and Mike, and they have 6 minutes each, and will be extremely strict because you know the ICRC is coming from Switzerland, so that's the only thing with which we don't joke. So, time. Oh yes, if you want to share the discussions this evening, you're welcome to tweet. And here is hashtag ICRC AU. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Ned, there we go.
Well, thanks very much for having me here again. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so we're going to argue that the military does have a role to play in humanitarian aid operations, perhaps not in every conceivable circumstance, but in certain kinds of cases. So I'm not going to ask you to accept a generalization that the military should always be involved all the way through. Rather, I'm asking you to reject a generalization, namely the generalization that there's no place for the military in aid operations. Melissa, I'm sure, has some very interesting things to say. My argument for the affirmative is pretty simple and pretty mundane, really, and it's just this. Militaries have a greater tolerance for risk than civilian aid organisations. The military is prepared to sacrifice lives and limbs for the sake of its work because for military personnel, danger is part of the job description. And this is important because delivering aid can be a risky enterprise, especially in combat zones, which are inherently dangerous places. Even outside of combat zones, aid can be dangerous. For example, following the earthquake in Nepal last year, supplies needed to be delivered to a remote mountain area. Everybody knew this was going to be dangerous. So US military helicopters were deployed to deliver the aid. One of them crashed in the mountains and everybody died. Aid organisations are understandably more cautious when it comes to these high-risk activities. And I say understandably because in a civilian workplace, like an aid organisation, this is an OH&S issue. Not so much in the military where the occupation itself is an OH&S issue. So that's my first point. Risk, particularly in conflict zones, risks must be borne to deliver aid with maximum scope and efficiency. Militaries are more comfortable with risk and better equipped and trained to manage it, both to protect themselves and to protect the aid workers alongside them, if there are any. Okay, so if this is right, then the involvement of the military can help to achieve a positive humanitarian outcome, to ensure that as many people as possible are rescued or assisted. So if that's the case, why shouldn't the military be involved? It seems like a no-brainer to me. Some folks say the military shouldn't be involved because militaries are political instruments of their states, and states always have selfish ulterior motives. They never act purely out of humanitarian concern. They've got some sort of agenda, and this is a worry. And to this I say, so what? Who cares? So here's a hypothetical. Imagine that somebody rescues a drowning child, and later we find out that the prick, he only did it for selfish reasons. Right? He thought there would be a reward, for example, otherwise he wouldn't have jumped in. Now, we might think less of this individual as a person, but we wouldn't say that he's done a bad thing because his motives were impure. Surely it's still a good thing that he rescued the child. Right? So selfish motives contaminate the agent, the person acting, but not the actions that stem from them. The actions are still good. So if the military's involvement in an emergency will have a positive humanitarian impact, as I think it might, I don't care what their underlying motives are, and I don't think you should care either. So this leads me to my second point. Some folks say that the military should not be involved in aid operations because aid ought to be impartial or neutral, and militaries invariably are not. They are parties to the conflict. I can appreciate that sometimes appearing neutral or impartial is a practical necessity. If it looks like you've got an agenda, there may be more resistance to your efforts, so for pragmatic reasons, act impartially. What I don't accept is the idea that neutrality is a moral virtue in its own right. Something to be aspired towards, something to be proud of, something that makes you a good person or a good institution. So here's another hypothetical. Imagine you come across a grown man beating up a child, and there's some other bloke standing by not getting involved, not doing a thing, congratulating himself for being neutral in this circumstance, saying, oh, I'm not taking sides. Yeah, you're not taking sides, but that's the problem. You should be taking sides, and a decent person would. And this is not purely hypothetical. There have been real cases of foreign aid where neutrality seems to have this perverse impact. So go back to the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s. After the genocide ended, there was a mass exodus from the country, and among the exodus was people that had perpetrated the genocide, right? So what happened was various aid agencies went over there to feed these people and set up refugee camps for them. What happened was, according to one author, what happened is that the Hutu power movement, which was responsible for the genocide, it quickly reconstituted itself in the refugee camps and used these camps as a base from which to launch further attacks on civilians. Even after the aid agencies began to suspect that this was happening, they didn't change a thing. Someone would go out and kill people by day. At night, they would return to the camp hungry and tired and maybe injured. So the aid workers would feed them and heal them and give them a place to recover, knowing that they would wake up the next day and go out killing people again. And one commentator, Philip Gorovich, says the aid agencies, effectively, they were catering for the genocide, and by so doing became complicit in it. Maybe that's what neutrality requires. People are in need, help them no matter who they are, but if that's what neutrality requires, I don't think it's of value. So the fact that the military isn't neutral doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't bother you either. Thanks, sorry.
I'll have something to say about those propositions a little later, but at the moment I want to make 6 points in favour of the negative case. The first point is that any blanket affirmation of military involvement in providing humanitarian assistance goes too far. And the reason for that is that militaries come in different shapes and sizes. Not all militaries are the same. There are some militaries that are not even remotely appropriate to have as agents to involve in humanitarian assistance at all. One thinks of the Wehrmacht, one thinks of the Red Army, one thinks of the armies and militaries that have been predatory agents in human history, and that not only militates against any kind of blanket affirmation of the role of military in humanitarian assistance, but I think should prompt us to think very carefully about the potential for even those militaries that we would assess more positively to be able to play positive roles in these kind of contexts. And one of the reasons for that is that military training is, and this is my second point, is fundamentally in the use of armed force for coercive or defensive purposes, albeit, one would hope, within the framework of international humanitarian law, which the Red Cross movement has been centrally involved in promoting for more than a century. But this kind of kinetic activity is a very different kind of activity from promoting humanitarian assistance. And I would want to note here that humanitarian assistance is actually a broader idea than simply the satisfactory treatment of displaced persons under customary international humanitarian law, where there is a recognition that militaries may have a particular role that they need to play if they are not to be in violation of core IHL principles. The third point, and it flows in a way from the second point, is that the most effective assistance to vulnerable communities or populations tends to be informed by a deep knowledge of the social complexities by which those communities or populations are marked. Militaries, especially at the lower combat levels, at the level of what one writer, Robert Kaplan, has called in respect of the US military, quote, imperial grunts, unquote, rarely have access to training in social anthropology. I haven't met too many privates or corporals who have had that kind of background. And with the very best will in the world, they may find it extraordinarily difficult to understand the environments in which they're operating, when the languages that are being used by local populations are different, when there are cultural norms and mores which are central to the sense of self-worth and value that are held by members of the population, and when effective delivery of assistance depends upon being able to engage in the careful mapping of social relations within communities as a crucial process of ensuring that those who are really in need end up being benefited by the activities that are being undertaken to provide assistance. And that leads to the fourth point that I want to make, and that is that there is a real danger that militaries, as a result of this, may deliver assistance in ways that have quite grave unintended consequences and may end up empowering dubious or unrepresentative actors. And it is very tempting for people who are injected at short notice into an unfamiliar environment to find somebody who can be a local partner and with whom they can work. But very often those who are local power holders already have not become power holders by virtue of human decency, but by virtue of other mechanisms for the accumulation of power. And working with them may actually consolidate the positions of those who are engaging in extractive or predatory behaviour towards the local population. This was actually a mistake which the Australian military made in the Afghan province of Uruzgan, where they partnered relatively early with a local power holder, Matiullah Khan, whom the Dutch had been very careful to keep at arm's length. And he was a member of the Popalzai tribe of Durrani Pashtuns, and partnering with him left a whole range of people within the province feeling marginalised. All the Durranis who weren't Popalzais, all the Pashtuns who weren't Durranis, and all the non-Pashtuns had reasons to be sceptical as to whether they would benefit under those circumstances. And of course, relatively shortly after the Australians withdrew, he was assassinated anyway. So anything that was premised on his being the linchpin of future development and humanitarian stability in the province was pretty rapidly lost. In the worst of circumstances, one may end up inadvertently providing resources that can then be used for further predatory extraction by actors who have acquired positions of dominance in the past. And this all reaffirms the importance of having actors in the humanitarian sphere who are capable of engaging in power mapping in such a way as can effectively position them to ensure that the unintended consequences of their actions are minimised. The fifth point that I want to make is that humanitarian assistance risks being seen by militaries through the lenses of their desired military and political outcomes. This was very blatantly stated by Colin Powell in December 2001 when he said, and I quote, "NGOs are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team." Now, given that combat objectives are likely to be different from humanitarian objectives, there's a lot to worry about when one hears that kind of view being expressed. And of course, this is radically at odds with any kind of ethos of neutrality and impartiality sitting at the heart of humanitarianism, and it highlights the real danger of mixed motives as a practical outcome. Finally, when militaries are parties to a conflict, their involvement in humanitarian assistance can expose civilian humanitarian actors to the risk of being viewed in the same light. One of the great protections for individual humanitarian actors serving in conflict zones is the perception that they are neutral and impartial. Anything that dents this perception runs the risk of exposing these very brave individuals to grave and unnecessary risk. And I think it's actually very important that we affirm the necessity of protecting people in those kind of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the gentlemen so far for showing their compassionate side and the arguments they've made. I'm going to take a different tack. I'm going to argue that militaries should be involved in humanitarian assistance because it's good for militaries. I accept it may be helpful for the downtrodden of the world, but that's not my argument. And to help illustrate this, I'm going to use a rubric beloved of pop psychologists everywhere. You know, there are only three things you need to be happy in life. You need something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to. And for militaries, humanitarian assistance in conflict fulfills all these needs. So, something to do. We are sure that there will be a humanitarian emergency somewhere on the planet. Interstate wars, which militaries are designed for, happen more rarely. And there's a genuine danger that the huge sums invested in the militaries around the world will just be an expensive waste of money. If you think of the US's 620 billion, whatever it is, China spends, who knows, even our 30 odd billion, there's a danger that all of the investments, extensive investments in personnel and material that we make becomes an insurance policy that is never used. I have 2 words for Mike Kelly. Manura and Canimbla. Now, these are 2 rather expensive amphibious vessels, not used for some time, which suffered from, if I've got it right, deep corrosion, problems with their systems, essentially rusted. And if we're going to make use of our militaries, this is a good place that they have something to do. Second, someone to love and to be loved back. Now, militaries want to be seen positively. And humanitarian assistance is a great way to project a positive image. So if you're the Chinese People Liberation Army, the neighbours are a bit concerned about the growth of the military, not so happy with what you're doing in the South China Sea, well, you've got to show a positive face. So why not look after 10,000 internally displaced people in Sudan? Good approach. If you're the US and you have legitimacy issues, whether it's invasion of Iraq, well, if you want to keep the well-being of women and girls in Afghanistan front and centre, that's going to be good for image, going to be good for recruiting videos. Militaries much more are seeing the importance of soft power. They're seeing the importance of attraction in international affairs. And being involved in aid is a great way to win hearts and minds. And third, something to look forward to. Now, I admit this might actually help the rest of us too. Involving militaries in humanitarian assistance means that they're invested, not just in current operations, but also into the future. They understand that humanitarian assistance is a vital element of military strategy, and therefore they become a constituency for aid, something that aid vitally needs. If we look at the cuts to humanitarian assistance and aid all around the world, part of the problem is that the people arguing for support are the ones who are marginalised. They tend to be part of the peace and justice community. I'm sure none of you here would recognise yourselves in that description, and don't always get their voices heard in the realms of the powerful. Now, militaries, in the end, have more clout. And if they're going in and saying that advocating for more resources to aid, they can get things done. So my argument is, if armed forces take on a sense of obligation to provide humanitarian aid, they can be a force for good, as well, incidentally, as making themselves happy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And as the organisers have pointed out, I'm somewhat conflicted here. I'm probably what might be described as a cross-dresser, having been in the military and also having served as a delegate of the ICRC. But I think we should get back to defining our terms here. The use of the word should is effectively a philosophical posit, and it basically is a philosophical question. Should the military? Well, I can answer that honestly and say no. The military should not be involved in humanitarian assistance. The question then is, must the military be involved in humanitarian assistance? And the answer to that is quite different, but also nuanced. So if we talk about humanitarian assistance, what levels of humanitarian assistance are we talking of? What types of humanitarian assistance? And when we talk about conflict, what do we mean by conflict? And my experience, of course, in the Army has put me through various iterations of that, from the linear battle space through to the more confused asymmetric circumstances where it's very difficult in higher threat environments where there is not a clear-cut issue of political geographic contests. Sometimes these descend into straight ethnic contexts where simply delivering humanitarian aid to another tribal or ethnic competitor involves you in the conflict immediately, so that someone providing humanitarian assistance might find themselves a target for that very reason. So things can become quite confused depending on the context. Linear battle space, quite different. And in that context, we have to understand that there are also legal parameters that come into play here. And it was because largely of the agitation of my colleagues in the ICRC, we had the moves to the creation and expansion of the laws of armed conflict after World War II, in particularly with the creation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. That Fourth Convention creates legal obligations on the military to take responsibility. And in the end, in this world, we are trying to create and promote the rule of law and create and generate accountability. It's led to the creation of the International Criminal Court, etc. That's not possible to do very easily in the context of non-government organisations in those environments. There's also a question of threat and capacity here. So at one level, humanitarian assistance in a high-threat environment where an NGO will not be present because they're not there with the means to defend themselves or someone who they're trying to assist. There's a question of immediate assistance that needs to be provided. And in that context, it's simply a question of stop the dying, and sometimes the military is in the position to do that, and they're the only people in the position to do that. But I think we can distinguish between humanitarian assistance in that immediate context and humanitarian in the long-term context. And there is where we find a lot of deficiencies and issues with the military. Longevity and reliability and systematic approach to humanitarian assistance is not something you can deploy a military to do with confidence or in any terms desirable. The military is often going to be the short-term interface of what's necessary in a particular situation. And so we need to understand there are different levels of humanitarian assistance at which NGOs, IOs and the military will have varying applications and uses. So, for example, no NGO will be able to use a C-17 Galaxy aeroplane to deliver vast quantities of humanitarian aid when it's needed immediately in large quantities. I'm glad you referred to the Manura and Canberra, which were actually rust buckets when they were bought, effectively. But now we have these magnificent landing helicopter dock vessels, which will be the poster child for that mix of spectrum of applications, the ability to deploy highly capable field hospitals that are based on those vessels with transport and other options to facilitate the dealing with large-scale casualties, etc. These are going to be wonderful assets. So at a certain level, the military will be absolutely necessary to deliver the large-scale plant, logistics support and whatever in a large-scale crisis in the context of that conflict. But when we're talking about down at the coalface, person-to-person contact where maybe the threat environment is becoming benign, then very certainly that's where our aid agencies, our NGOs and our IOs are definitely the better people to do things. And the very important point that my colleague Bill made about not all militaries are the same is fundamental here. Whatever we do in this space, no military should be engaged in these activities without them being properly trained, properly doctrinally underpinned and led, and the planning being wrapped around that involvement. And I'm very pleased to see Dr. Alan Ryan here tonight, who's the physical embodiment of that concept, being the Executive Officer of the Australian Civil Military Centre, which we established, and it sits within Defence, but not out of choice. It sits there because Defence is better at doing planning, organising, mobilising. If we could have a civil agency that was good at mobilising and planning and organising on that kind of scale, for certain an organisation like it might be better to be under a PMNC or other type organisation. But what we have here is a discussion based on short-termism, on the need to do something quickly and effectively in a conflict and high-threat environment. And in that environment, we have no choice but to use the military. So the issue is, should the military be used in humanitarian assistance in conflict? No, it shouldn't. But it must be used, and when it is used, it has to be used, and it should not be used unless it is encapsulated in that planning, in that training, in that leadership, and in coordination with those humanitarian organisations. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will soon move to the second part where we will give you a chance to reply to the arguments of the adverse party. But I don't know if you have the same feeling as I have, but it seems to me that we had a very clear-cut discussions and arguments at the beginning with our two first panelists, and then we had some critical distance, I think, in your points, Melissa, if I may say. And also with Mike, I think with the the richness of his experience, we seem to conclude on the point that Ned raised at the beginning on the efficiency of military intervention. So I think we see through this debate that things are not so clear-cut as what they seem at the beginning. But I suggest that, Ned, you take now the floor and try to address some of the arguments which were raised by the adverse party in this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I can't get through much because I've only got 3 minutes. So I'll say 3 things. 2 in response to Professor Maley's comments, and then 1 in response to Mike Kelly's comments. So first, this idea that militaries aren't adequately trained for humanitarian purposes. They're trained for combat. To me, that seems like an argument for rethinking the way that we train our militaries rather than an argument for their non-involvement in military operations. Second, there's this idea that militaries might not have an adequate appreciation of the political and social complexities and grievances that generate conflicts to begin with, and given that, they might not be able to do much about it in the long term. But militaries need not operate in a vacuum. The Pentagon consults with anthropologists and social scientists all the time, so it seems like they could, just like a politician could be advised about before making their decisions, the military could be advised by those in the know before engaging in their operations. Third, Mike Kelly's claim that the military might have a role to play in the immediate short term when people are, I'm not sure if people have heard this statistic, but during the Rwandan genocide that I mentioned, on average 420 people were killed every hour, 7 every minute for 100 days. Right? So you might think in those sorts of emergencies where people are being butchered en masse, about 10,000 a day, there's a role for the military to go in, to stop the killing, and then to retreat. And I'll take that as a partial concession to our side, that there is some role for the military to play. But I have worries which lead me to believe that the military might have more of a long-term role to play. There was a very famous paper by a guy called Edward Lutwak called Give War a Chance, where he talks about when cases where the military does just that. They go in, they stop the killing, and they leave. What tends to happen is that the parties, the warring parties, just use that as an opportunity to regroup and reconstitute themselves and rearm, and then the conflict resumes as soon as the military leaves. So there's kind of no point in that kind of operation. So we might think that there is a place for a bit more of a long-term occupation, if you like, on the part of militaries to make sure that the conflict doesn't just resume as soon as they depart. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
On the issue of training, I was involved for 19 and a half years in teaching at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and one of the things I realised was just how difficult it was to penetrate the mindsets at certain levels in the military. And we used to have very sophisticated and philosophically rich lectures for the students, and the sergeants in charge of the students used to say to them, righto, off to basket weaving, and there was not all that much reinforcement for what we were trying to convey in terms of sophisticated understanding of complexity. And I think this also comes to the surface when we look at the issue of the engagement of militaries with anthropologists. There have been, of course, things like the human terrain system that was put in place by the United States, but that created issues not only with the American Anthropological Association, which was critical of the ways in which anthropologists might be engaging with communities, perhaps in a way that the communities might come to see as duplicitous, but also exposed the anthropologists to risk. And in fact, Michael Battier, who was a very fine young writer on Afghanistan, was killed when the tank in which he was travelling with the military hit an anti-vehicle mine in Afghanistan, and that, together with the murder of a young American lady who was doused with petrol and set on fire, raised questions about the ability to bring in anthropologists from the outside within a military context, because they ended up being seen as a very soft target that could be struck if an attempt were to be made to hit at the militaries. I also wonder about the argument that militaries have greater tolerance of risk than NGOs. In fact, my sense in the field is that it's often the people who are in the humanitarian aid sector who are out in some of the riskiest areas. And whilst the military themselves in the field are also willing to encounter those kind of risks, very often the politicians who stand behind them are not. And democratic governments can be extremely alert to the risk of even small numbers of casualties amongst their military who've been contributed to operations, and it may not take that much in terms of damage to produce a complete extraction of a force from a wider mission in which it plays a critical role. And this, of course, was why the génocidaires in Rwanda struck first at the Belgians, because they realised that if they could precipitate a withdrawal of the Belgian contingent by killing Belgian soldiers, there wouldn't be many people left to make a viable contingent. And just a final point in response to Melissa. I really loved her presentation. I felt that she was probably working for us behind the scenes, but her giving the military something to do. They can mow my lawn. I've got a very large lawn, and there are lots of things militaries can do that don't involve treading on the toes of humanitarian actors. And that would, in fact, bring in another very well-known principle of life that was sung by Vera Lynn during the Second World War. Please give me something to remember you by. If the military mowed my lawn, I would remember them with warmth for many years. Thank you.
Well, I feel we've been very fortunate that, in fact, both of the speakers have argued on our case. I heard two important concessions. First from Bill, that it's impossible to give a blanket approval or disapproval, that it depends critically on the nature of military, which means in some circumstances he agrees. And secondly from Mike, saying that while he doesn't feel we should, that in many circumstances, in reality, there is no choice but to use the military. It must be used, and therefore it must be prepared. So with that, I could probably stop. But I will finish. I will come back to Ned's point at the beginning. And that's really about humanitarian assistance in extremis. I think that's what we're talking about, the short term. If you use Ned's example and you think about the child that's drowning, they don't care that the rescuer might have lost their much vaunted neutrality by helping. They don't care that the rescuer possibly wasn't the best person to do it. They don't care that the rescuer doing this might set an example that will endanger future rescuers. They just want help. And we will say that in an imperfect world, we want the actors that can best help to give that help. In a world where militaries are the best funders, best funded, best resourced actors, it's unconscionable of them not to involve themselves where they can assist.
I guess what I want to avoid is the bull in the crockery shop syndrome, when some large military organisations come in and breach the old doctor's dictum of do no harm. And that is often a risk when militaries get involved, unless there's, as I say, a lot wrapped around that. Of course, NGOs can sometimes do that too. I know in Somalia this was a real conundrum. You had a lot of NGOs who, because of the threat environment, actually armed themselves quite heavily in some cases. I have a wonderful photo of an MSF vehicle with a heavy machine gun on the roof. And of course, that started fueling the arms trade in Somalia, and it led to higher levels of insecurity of NGO activity. So it can work both ways, but in terms of the military, the issue here is in terms of the thought that goes into the humanitarian assistance and where you can, taking advantage of that impartiality factor. So, and I think here particularly of the ICRC example, where the reputation for impartiality and independence enables the RCIC to cross the battle lines, which is so critical in so many circumstances where there are many dimensions to family reunions, to providing and getting assistance to areas. And Bosnia and Herzegovina was a classic example where certain NGOs were very happy to work the Bosnian Muslim side of the line because they were seen to be the good guys. And almost none of them were prepared to work the Serbian side of the line, even though you had just as needy women and children on that side of the line. Something like 400 on the Bosnian side, only about 6 on the Serbian side. It was the ICRC that tried to even out that circumstance and was mandated and capable and organised and prepared to do that. So, and in that circumstance, far better to have an organisation like that doing that work than a military organisation. So there are circumstances where you desperately need that umbrella of independence and impartiality, where a uniform will be definitely an absolute negative, create more problems than they solve. But also, you know, we had this situation where sometimes militaries focused more on this issue, and you've had mention here of the hearts and minds overall military strategy, which in some ways is legitimate, but if it leads you to go into a village where an NGO has already been rendering medical assistance and you're trying to double up on the immunisation program or whatever and completely cutting across some sort of longer term humanitarian plan that may be in place, then these things also are counterproductive and waste of resources. So, but I come back to the fundamental point that unless you have a military that is trained and prepared, and fortunately in the Chief of Army, Peter Lay, we had someone who created the adaptive campaigning doctrine, which actually has helped drive a lot of that in our own military. So I'd have more confidence in our guys doing it, and gals, but not so much in many others.
Well, thank you. That's the end of our discussion and the debates here. I will try to maybe get some ideas out of this very rich session, and maybe also take this opportunity to give you a nuanced view, the one of the ICRC, which is being confronted to the problem in the field. So I will also have my 6 minutes, which is my privilege as moderator, but which is also maybe putting this discussion into the context of humanitarian action today, as we see it at the International Committee of the Red Cross. But before that, I would like to go back to the first question and see if some of you have changed their minds. So I will ask it again after we've listened to these very powerful arguments. So should military be involved in providing humanitarian assistance during conflict? Have you changed your mind? So are you still feeling the same? So those who are in favor of this idea, could you raise your hands? Okay. Yes. And those who are against? Yeah, still located on this side, obviously. So it seems that opinions are still very balanced. I think it was a very rich discussion. You draw on historical examples. You refer to ethics, to pragmatic arguments. If I sum up the discussion, I think the question of the pragmatic argument came with you strongly, Ned, with the efficiency and the fact that there are greater tolerance for risks in the armed forces, and you were in a way rejoined by Mike, who gave also very pragmatic arguments. Then you move to the question of the motives. Maybe they are indifferent, provided we give assistance and help. But this argument, which is very consequentialist, was not always shared by some others. I would think of you, Melissa, even though you were in the same party as Ned. I think you adopted a very principled approach in your first arguments. Then moving to a very pragmatic one, which is actually, after all, that the military have indeed large fundings, and that these fundings can be employed for many other things. We discussed with Bill a series of arguments, and you drew a lot on your experience in Afghanistan to look at very practical problems. And for instance, the training of the armed forces in dealing with the civilian population. I think it was something you raised, the difficulty of having the right people to do so in the field, I think was well illustrated. The question also of the difficult environments in which we operate with the difficult choice for partners that you highlighted. I think, Mike, we can see that you work both in the ICRC and the military, because you've raised some arguments. You
I
could,
think I argued for our side, didn't I?
and you also raised very pragmatic arguments based on your experience, but also legal arguments, which are also part of the problem. So I cannot capture the entire discussion now. Of course, I would say that it's one thing to discuss it here in this room, and I think we should do it even though there is no burning issue. I mean, we are not discussing of something which is an issue that we need to address today. But we know that it was the case not so long ago, especially in relation with the context in Afghanistan, that we've seen the cases of the involvement of the militarization of the military in humanitarian assistance in many recent conflicts. So it's good we discuss it now in this format, because we can. But in the heat of the armed conflict, we may not have this distance to discuss this issue. And I think it's vital we draw the lessons of past conflicts so that we don't make the same mistakes sometimes. And rational arguments that we can use today appear very weak when there are fear of terror attacks, or when the country is at war, when the army is engaged in the field. And even for humanitarian actors, it's extremely difficult sometimes to make the right decisions because we don't have the time for these kind of discussions when making operational choices to engage with the military or not, to risk our reputation if some humanitarian actors decide to accept armed escorts to provide humanitarian assistance. So this discussion is important to maintain, and I think that's the meaning I want to give to this discussion this evening, that we keep alive this discussion and draw lessons from the past for future crises. So I'd like to thank you for this and for having accepted to take sometimes positions which were, well, quite obviously not always yours, I have to say. Now let me say just a word on the ICRC views on that. And I think it's based on our experience that we can speak of this, an experience of operating in conflict areas all over the world and of having been involved in these discussions in actual situations of conflicts. We have always tried to establish a dialogue with the military and with governments on these issues. So I think that was part of the work you did, Mike, in the field. So we are not considering that, you know, the other side is, I'll say that we have to create a humanitarian space against the parties to the conflict, but actually they are part of the solution. They are the ones which have obligations under international humanitarian law. And so this dialogue is there to enable us to perform our mission and sometimes to remind them their obligations. But it's something that is primarily their responsibility to create sometimes the capacity for humanitarian actors to operate independently. And that's why it's crucial that we dialogue on these issues and that we understand our respective constraints. It's an important question because it involves the security of the staff, and that's at the heart of our discussion, because the blurring of lines, as it was mentioned, can create security problems for humanitarian workers in the field. And ultimately, they are not the ones who suffer the most of this lack of capacity to have access to conflict zones, but the people we were supposed to help and we cannot have access anymore are the ones who ultimately suffer from possible security incidents. So, yes, there were lots of progress in the field of international humanitarian law. Yes, there are many mechanisms today which are in place. However, humanitarian space is not something which exists independently of a negotiation and of perceptions that humanitarian actors are truly independent and are truly operating on the basis of their principles. So this is the big issue, because perceptions matter, and confusion created in the minds of the local population by the militarization of aid can put the humanitarian actors in a dangerous position. However, this being said, there is no question today that the military has a role to play. And as Mike said, in some circumstances, they must act. They must protect the civilian populations. Under international humanitarian law, they have a special responsibility to do so. And so, for instance, to evacuate wounded civilians or to take care of populations in occupied territories, they have an obligation to do so. So the question is not so much if they should or not, if they must or not. They have also legal obligations to do so. But while doing so, we often see that there are other motives, and that humanitarian action could be used, indeed, as you mentioned, as a tool to win hearts and minds of the population. This is not only done, by the way, by the military. We also see armed groups which apply tactics of guerrilla, trying to do the same, securing acceptance of the local population. It's not at all a question that it is only for military armed forces. Non-state armed groups also do so. So there is a red line, in our view, between the role that the military can play, indeed, with logistics, with capacities, which can make a big difference, especially in the short term, indeed, as you said. But a line should be drawn when this humanitarian assistance is provided in order to gain military advantages, intelligence, security, and then can create the perception that actually humanitarian actors, those who are trying to help, are also part of a global coalition or are taking side in the conflict. It is often said also, and I think there has been research, that actually it may be an ineffective tactic, that actually trying to distribute food or assistance in order to secure acceptance may actually not work. And I think also the militaries are also looking at this and assessing some of their past tactics in the field of counterinsurgency and realizing that maybe it was not so effective after all, trying to win hearts and minds this way. To conclude, this is also the responsibility of humanitarian actors, and I think it was important you raised also this point, Mike. When humanitarian actors accept armed escorts or are not truly impartial in the way they deliver assistance, they also expose the population and other humanitarian actors to risk. So it's also important for humanitarian actors themselves, when they claim to abide by the humanitarian principles, to walk the talk. So on this, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this discussion. As I said, it's part of a series. So the next event will take place in London on the 30th of November. And the debate continues because there we will discuss the application of humanitarian principles in a polarization era. So we will discuss, again, some of these issues we'll discuss this evening, especially the issues related to counterterrorism and terrorism and how does it affect humanitarian action. I don't know if it will be a live webcast, but it will for sure be available on our webpage on the ICRC.org. So thank you very much, and don't forget that there are refreshments served outside the room. So we hope you will join us and continue the discussion with our panelists. Thank you very much. Good evening.